All right, so it's 12:10. We expect a few more folks to trickle in as we go, but we're going to get started. This is the Open Referral Assembly. I am both facilitating and managing people as they stumble into this thing, so bear with me as I get a little distracted. We have the, let's see, we have the document where we're taking notes. That is going to be over here in the chat column for anybody who's not yet in it. I encourage you to get in there, introduce yourself, and leave any questions or topics that you might want to share with the group in there. One person is asking for a little bit of help getting in, so I'm going to add them here, and then let's see. Yes. Okay. We are pretty much here in large part to put a stamp on version 1.0 of the Human Services Data Specification, which has gone through many rounds of community review. And we'll be talking about what's going to come next, how this thing is actually going to be used in the field, how we'll be testing and evaluating it, and sort of getting a sense of where people's heads are at about any parts of those processes. So again, we'll start off with introductions, go around, share who you are, in what way are you working on this, any questions you've had about the process so far, and what you'd like to talk about now.
Hey, I can start if no one else wants to. My name is Declan Fry. I'm with Purple Binder. We're a startup INR provider based in Chicago. And we've been involved with Open Referral because we have a number of clients that are city governments, municipal governments, and they're really interested in sharing their data about human services in their city. And so that's one of the things we do for them, and we looking for a good format to release that in is how we initially became involved with Open Referral. We're also involved in one of the Open Referral semi-official, I guess, pilots here in Chicago, sharing data with an organization called MRelief. So yeah, we've been involved for about a year now, and it's really exciting that version 1.0 is finally here.
Do you have any questions for us that you'd like to talk about now or in the future?
Yeah, I feel like we've made really good progress in developing a technical framework for sharing this data, but looking at some of the larger organizations that produce it, I feel like there's still a little bit of an open question around what is the economic model for how they can share that information without putting themselves out of business. So that's something that I'd like to talk about if we have time today, if anyone else is interested.
Okay. Great. So sustainability models.
Yes, sustainability.
All right, I'll add that to the agenda. Who goes next? Evan.
My name's Devin. I work on a services directory in New York City, focused mostly on people who are affected by Superstorm Sandy, and the services relevant to them. We're kind of a grassrootsy group of a half dozen people who've recognized this being an issue, and so I've been using Ohana a bit to get our services integrated, and we're still very much going through a process of service integration and updating. And I'm hoping to integrate. We also use a emergency management information system called Sahana, no relation to Ohana, that tracks facilities and contacts and things like that. So we're hoping to integrate this human services specification into the Sahana system, which is also an open source Python-based system. And that would, and then that would make our life a lot easier because then we'd only have to manage one system, and it would provide more accessible options for people who want to use the HS, the services spec. So that's kind of position.
Great. And Rory.
I'll just unmute myself. Yes, I'm Rory. I've been working with CodeAcross. I've had a residency with a local authority in Scotland, a small rural area called culmination. And the main thing that they wanted me to do was put together a means of citizens accessing information about childcare and childcare services. So about 6 months ago, came across SMC Connect and the Ohana project.
I think we lost you. We might have lost Rory. Okay. If we get Rory back, we'll loop him in. Saskia, do you want to go ahead while we're waiting for Rory?
Sure. My name's Saskia. I'm Saskia DeRees. I'm working in DC with the DC Open 2-in-1, and I've been focusing on trying to get some data into the database working with Parts of the City.
And Jeffrey, welcome again.
Thank you.
Do you want to introduce yourself, share a little bit about your interest? Or are we good?
Yeah, I'm Jeffrey Roberts. When all is said and done, I'm kind of like a software developer, and I'm interested in this open referral thing, and I've done a little work on my own on it up to date, implemented a backend and persistence to the database based on the specification. I did that over a couple days, and but I just did that for fun, and here I am wanting to get more into it.
Okay, great. All right, so we've had some people having trouble. I'm hearing that there are folks who are simply watching. They're not able to access the Hangout. I apologize for the troubles that folks have had. This is certainly an imperfect tool, and we do the best with it. But and by the way, I'm actually always willing to entertain other ideas for how to make these conference calls go smoother and more effective for folks. In the meantime, I forgot to ask Devin, Saskia, Jeffrey, whether each of you have specific questions that you want to make sure that we talk about. If one comes up, go ahead, shout it out. Otherwise, please go into the doc and just leave the notes and I'll see them. So we will spend the rest of about 40 more minutes. We'll be talking about like how we got to version 1.0. We'll be talking about the path, any issues that are still remaining. You know, we had to go ahead and make some decisions provisionally on just to be able to have a finished thing. But this is a living document. It's a living process, and so we'll talk about issues that are very much live moving forward. And how we're going to go forth into the world, send this thing out there, test it, evaluate it, and improve it over time. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the work group process, what went well and what we can improve in the future. And Declan also mentioned, interest, which is very much a central interest of the initiative, in demonstrating sustainability models. So we actually might, I'm going to arrange that so we'll talk about work groups after that conversation. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have about 5 minutes to actually talk about the format of these assemblies and how we have these convenings moving forward. So let me just make sure there's nobody else pinging me and letting me know that they're having trouble or need some help. And okay, so we have, I assume that people are somewhat familiar with the spec, everybody on here. And a few of you have actually been really active in commenting, and I thank you for your time and your efforts. What we have now is, like, I guess you could call it a beta. something that's ready to be tested, but that we know will contain various points that potentially break for people. And I think the idea is that over the next year, through the pilot projects that we have with different kinds of institutions on the ground testing it, we want to see what breaks. We want to learn from their experiences. We expect that people are going to have to adapt it in order to work for them, and we're going to have a strong process of review and evaluations so that we can learn from those adaptations, preserving some coherence and interoperability across the board. I'm excited because the pilot projects that are emerging have real similarities between them, but they are also in different contexts. So I think we're going to have a rich set of opportunities to test this and get a variety of perspectives and how it can and should work. Does anybody have like specific issues about the spec, topics that you discussed that you want to bring back and sort of have out? There was one discussion in particular that I definitely want to recap, and another proposal. It's a technical discussion, and then there's a sort of like meta question about the nature of this as a resource that we'll all share. But first, any thoughts out there, things that you specifically want to talk about the spec? We can go around. I'm fine if nobody has any of them, especially since Sophia is not even on the call yet.
If nobody has anything else, over the summer when we had the summit in Oakland, I remember there was a lot of discussion about who was using the spec, and we developed these 4 user profiles. As the spec has grown more complex over the last 6 months, it seems to me that some of those no longer apply as well, so maybe this is the right forum to revisit those profiles and see what people think about them.
So for some context for the people on the call who weren't there in the workshop, David, hello. David Beal from San Francisco just joined us as well. And David, I'll throw it back to you a little bit down the line so we can address Declan's point right now and then hear an introduction from you later. So for some context, we identified 4 different types of users, broad types of users, who have stakes in this game, so to speak, who are impacted by systems that aggregate and circulate community resource directory data. Those types of users, speaking very broadly, were help seekers, service providers, meaning anybody who's in a position of providing help to a person who's seeking help, data administrators, and researchers and analysts. And the original objective of our specification was to develop a format that could enable data to transfer between systems, be exchanged between systems, openly published, consumed, a format that would be simple, that would it would have fidelity, it would indicate like the quality of data, it would indicate the source of data, and could be sort of, it would be flexible for people to actually implement on the back in their own system as they wish. And as Declan's pointing out, what we now have, I would not go so far as to say we made our goal of achieving something that is actually truly simple. The spec is complex. I think that actually reflects the richness of the feedback that we got from our community of people in different perspectives who indicated like the different real needs of people wading through a maze of information. But for sure, I think to Declan's point, when we're thinking about the specification itself, those other users are sort of, especially help seekers, service providers, researchers, and administrators, their considerations inform the development of the spec, but the actual user of the spec itself are data administrators. And there will be tools that we develop through the pilots that are developed specifically for people who are entering data potentially in a service provider role, and also interfaces for help seekers. But the spec itself is a tool that data administrators can use to move resource data between systems and to publish it and so on and consume it. And that is probably going to inform our perspective as we go from this essentially alpha product into something that's becoming more robust and usable. We'll be thinking very specifically, what do the data administrators need for a system in order to make this work with their systems? Without losing sight, I'd say, Declan, of the needs of the other three use cases, which are ultimately do need to be served by the spec, even if they're not using it. Do you have other thoughts about how that reality that this spec is essentially used by data administrators, even though it does ultimately have to meet the needs of these other types of users, how that informs our process? Do you have thoughts on that?
Sure, that was a great recap, Greg, so thanks. And ultimately, yes, I completely agree that the end result is to help the person who's seeking services. And so ultimately all this work is for that person's benefit. Yeah, one concrete example that's come up in the last few weeks is whether we believe there will be people producing data by writing it into Excel spreadsheets. And so I think that a conversation around who's actually going to be producing that data and is that the format that they'll use would inform those discussions we've been having. As I think of more, I'll write them in the chat section or the notes or something.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, I think I'll go ahead and sort of spin this issue into a very actionable topic, which is, we have a spec that is designed to enable systems to talk to each other. What are the tools that we need to enable people to interact with data and those systems that you're using this spec? For example, Monsef made a spreadsheet for the previous version of the specification. We can share that and talk a little bit about it, but that's actually going to be one of the primary topics moving forward that we're looking at with the pilots and helping the pilots figure out is how do we make it easy for people to produce compliant data, given the reality that this specification is actually really complex and probably in and of itself difficult for non-technical users to wrap their heads around. I do have a little bit of an update on thinking about what's the path ahead, but don't want to rush past other folks who've been thinking about this little introduction to how we got here. Any other questions or thoughts? So the important point about the path ahead is that the Ohana team, which has been leading the development of the API, which is our reference implementation, and Sophia, the lead Ohana developer, was the lead on this data model. They had a grant from the Knight Foundation that that grant is now expired. Their work is pretty much done, and they'll be moving on with hopefully, Monsef especially. He's already committed to essentially be a volunteer member of this community moving forward. In the meantime, Code for America is going to be recruiting and hiring a product lead, a product resident, that's going to be working to steward this specification and Ohana in partnership with the Open Referral initiative, but over the course of the next few cycles, in sort of 3-month cycles. And that person is going to be meeting specifically with the pilot projects, figuring out what the needs are for their users, and potentially developing the Ohana code base to meet those needs. I also believe we're going to be bringing on a data analyst position to work somehow in partnership with that capacity to pick up the spec now that Sophia's put it down, evaluate how it's actually being used in the field, where it is and is not meeting needs, process some of those learnings for us to reflect on, and also develop both spreadsheets and tools and also content to make it easy for people to use this thing. over the course of the next year. So those are two separate roles that we're going to be bringing on over the next, hopefully, 1 to 2 months to be working in 3-month cycles through the summer and the fall. And our conversations here can help set the agenda for those people and the work that they do. So that's a little background on where things are at this point in time moving forward. Questions about that? Okay. So we can talk a little bit about the pilot projects and think about how that plays out in those contexts. Because again, this is an open initiative. The idea is we want people to join our group. Folks like Jeffrey, who are just coming in, I think can make a great contribution. But ultimately, our objective is to demonstrate in very specific places that publishing open data with a common specification is actually good for everyone. And to speak to Declan's point earlier, that's not just everyone in an abstract sense. That's very specifically the institutions that collect this data. Our hypothesis is that publishing in an open and standardized format is actually good for them. It helps them achieve their own goals, decreasing the cost of producing data, increasing the value of that data. That's our hypothesis, and now we have to go ahead and prove it. We have to demonstrate that. And that will happen through these pilot projects, including DC and San Francisco. We had David from San Francisco on the call. He seems to have dropped off again. But we do have Saskia on the call. We can talk a little bit about what's happening in DC. And also Miami, the 211 in Miami is partnering with the Code for Miami Brigade. And also then in Chicago with Purple Binder. In fact, Chicago is the first, thanks to Purple Binder and the Smart Chicago Collaborative, the first to actually go ahead, and they have an open they have an API that if you want to consume from it, as I understand, they'll set this up, and mRelief is already pulling resource directory data from the Purple Binder database, and I can let Declan speak a little bit more to that. But again, looking at both of these, all of these pilots, our question is, how can we demonstrate that open data is actually good for the bottom line, that there's business models to be found here, and in fact that's actually the most viable business model is an open and standardized one. And so I'm eager to hear from you all how we design, how you think we should design this process moving forward to check the viability of the spec and improve its viability in order to find these business models, nurture them to a point of demonstrable success, and promote them to other communities. So we can go around a little bit, because I feel like I just talked a whole lot. Declan, you brought it up. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. You've been active in the process of developing the specification. You're already publishing data that other applications are using. What are your thoughts about what we want to accomplish over the next, over the 1.0 to 2.0 cycle?
Over the 1.0 to 2.0 cycle. Sure, and I just, before we get into that, if any of you don't know about mRelief, they're a fantastic organization here in Chicago. They do benefits eligibility screening. I'll chat a link to them in the window, but you all should check them out. They're our partner with our Open Referral pilot here. So, right, as far as sustainability models, I'll say that I don't feel like I have a good answer to this yet. I certainly have faith that there is a good answer, and that's why we've been involved in this process for the past year and want to continue to be involved. But in all the clients that we've worked with so far, it's been a case where we're producing the data and they're consuming it, and they're hiring us because they believe that we can do it at lower cost than having their staff do it internally, just because we have expertise in doing that. And so that works fairly well in situations where there's one entity, like a city government, that is capable of funding that project. I know that's how many of the United Way's 211s operate as well. They get funding to collect all the information for a certain geography. And then depending on their arrangement, they may or may not release that in an open format as well. But the labor is fairly centralized, and the funding is fairly centralized as well. So, what I'm really interested in thinking more about is some of the pilot sites like DC or San Francisco, where I know there's more than one organization producing this data, and seeing if there's been any discussion there about sharing the cost of producing the data in a sort of a more formal sense than just, oh, well, we happen to have this collection of spreadsheets and you guys have that collection, so let's smash them together and see what we get. And I think that could be a question around licensing data. It could be a question around agreements to produce data to a certain quality standard in a certain amount. But I don't know. I don't feel like I have an answer yet.
Yeah, Saskia and I can talk a little bit about the DC pilot, which does start to move in those directions. Before we jump back in, other thoughts from Jeffrey or Devin? And then I think we'll also introduce David and their situation in San Francisco, because that's also relevant to Declan's point. All right, hearing nothing from Declan or Jeffrey. Saskia, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, speak a little bit about the work that you've been doing so far, and if you can contextualize it in Declan's observation of a situation where it's not a centralized hub, but rather multiple organizations.
Sure. So my name is Saskia DeVries. I'm volunteering on the Open 2-in-1 project. I met up with Greg through Code for DC, and I've been focusing on this data entry piece with Bread for the City. The Bread for the City is a nonprofit in DC that provides referral services and services on site. They have a clinic and food pantry and things like that. But they also have a great resource manual. So we're trying to figure out how to move their resource manual into something that will work with Ohana. And rather than moving 10-year-old data over, we've decided it's better to start from scratch and just re-enter everything. We have a couple organizations around the city who are also interested in helping with this, and they might have some volunteer labor available to help with the data entry. So someone at Bread for the City built a data entry screen in Salesforce, and we've been testing that over the past few weeks, having volunteers try to enter organization data to see where they get stuck, the fields that we might remove just because it's complicated, and documenting questions along the way. So we're hoping that we could have 2 rounds of data entry. We don't think volunteers will be able to put all of the required information into the database, but we think we can save the social workers some time by having volunteers do like the low-hanging fruit, like organization name, phone number, address, some like basic eligibility criteria. So that's where we are right now. We have several recommendations now from our volunteers and some of the social service providers. We will be going back to revise our data entry system.
Great. Thank you, Saskia. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about DC, but I do want to kick it to David. David, go ahead and tell us a little bit about your work on the Homeless Wiki, and given the recent turn in the conversation, contextualize it around the other organizations or other ways that that same information is collected in your community, and how any initial thoughts about this path towards potentially aligning among them.
Sure. Can everyone hear me though?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Had some technical difficulties. So I missed most of the conversation before as I was trying to install my plugin to get this to work. But now that it appears to be working, so I founded what's called sfhomeless.net in San Francisco. It takes the city's homeless resources, which is about 700 agencies plus. They're always changing, and it updates them through a wiki format. We host on Wikia, which is it's a for-profit wiki hosting company. They run ads, but they've given us very special consideration and taken the ads off our site so that they can help promote the nonprofit nature and make it more acceptable to the governments and others who are using the site. So we appreciate that. But again, there's always been the issue of how do the agencies update, or how are they motivated to update the site. I've given probably 20 trainings to various nonprofits in town, and they're very, very good people. They're social workers. But one of my things that I've noticed is that they tend to only really want to work with the client directly. So when it comes to updating resources, even though it's in their interest and everybody else's best interest, they just become neglectful. This is sort of like an upward trend where it's a lot of wikis have very flat user interfacing, and then all of a sudden it'll just sort of like fire up. So we've been waiting for that for several years to happen. It's beginning to happen a little bit, but I really think that Greg's Open Referral plan, which I've only learned about in the past couple of weeks. I've had a couple of meetings with Greg, and I really think there's a lot of hope for having these silos be managed by trusted users and then being accessible to a variety of other types of websites and databases, including Wiki, so that we can download the most trusted version of the resource and then present it in our own fashion. We go beyond just having the resources. We're trying to form a community around the resources. We're trying to present the resources in ways that people didn't realize, that the resources told a story beyond just where and when and how to use them. So we were really exploring that in San Francisco, and I think based on, again, my meetings with Greg and some of my other meetings at Code for America, I really think that there's a lot of community support behind this idea. I'm trying to gather up support and do more investigations to see if this is an idea whose time has finally come. And I think with everybody loves our wiki. We get about 2,000 hits a day, and we have top Google results when you're looking for the resources. So we know people love the site. So I believe that people are really looking for some kind of solution that will guarantee that the resources that they're looking at are the most up-to-date and they're most reliable, because it really doesn't exist right now in San Francisco or anywhere else in the country that I'm aware of. I mean, there have been so many different attempts, and they always require too much people power to update them. It requires too much programming time to update them. There's too many firewalls in between, and I believe that this particular open referral movement could really provide some of the answers to make sure that the communities have the best information possible.
Thank you, David.
Sure.
So let me try to crystallize what we just heard from David and Saskia in the context of Declan's original question about sustainability, and also I think Declan made a very important point of observing very different environments that we're dealing with here. On one hand, you have an environment where there's one organization that's funded potentially by one funder or a small number of funders to provide this data aggregation as a service. And in a couple of cases, those organizations are now saying, okay, we want to experiment with making that data available in this format. Specifically, those cases right now, Chicago with Purple Binder, and in Miami, the 211 there, they've said, okay, we also, most of our bread and butter comes from programs that we provide that add value to this data. We don't think we should own this data, so let's experiment with making it available for different purposes. So we have a couple of pilot projects where our hypothesis going into this initiative is that an organization that collects comprehensive resource directory data can sustainably and generatively open it up, become an open platform, and that will not only be good for its community, but also be good for its bottom line. That's one hypothesis that we're looking to test. I think the more common scenario, which is reflected by DC and San Francisco. There isn't necessarily one organization that really is on top of all of the data for all of the domains. It's not really a centralized situation. You have multiple organizations or multiple community groups that collect this data in different ways with different focuses. And our other hypothesis there is that a network of invested stakeholders, given a viable data model and the tools that enable them to use it to collaborate, can essentially share quality share in the responsibility of maintaining quality resource data over time. So those are two very different scenarios, and we're looking to test them both. And in DC, we have a situation where there's one community-based organization that's just done this because they're big enough and they have enough resources and they're good enough at their jobs that they just maintained it internally, and now they're going to make that an open resource. And on the government side, the city, which operates the 211 in the district, is going to be publishing all of the city services data, all the services offered by the government in their Open 211 platform. And so we're starting with these two different sources, and potentially we've already identified a bunch of different other organizations or agencies that focus on particular subdomains. And so starting with just bread for the city and the district government, enabling their systems to talk to each other using this language, that's probably what's going to be taking up the majority of the next 6 months or even the year. And then looking to figure out how can we bring more and more organizations into that network and facilitate conversations among them about the finer points of sharing responsibility, establishing domain-specific stewardship, so on and so forth. And in San Francisco, we have a similar situation with a different configuration of players, where the city government is saying, we want to get all the different agencies that produce directories here or there to output in the same format and potentially in the longer run use the same system. The 211 is at the table saying, the 211 in San Francisco has already given us their data. We've exposed it through Ohana. We're experimenting with different ways to align it. And then we have a number of community groups like David's, in addition to the San Francisco Bar Pro Bono, which produces like a 400-page Word document, and then Link SF, which is an app that came out of St. Anthony's and Zendesk, which has the same, data on the same services that they're delivering through a mobile-friendly application. And those are all different ways, wiki, mobile app, and this printed booklet. Those are all valid ways that serve different purposes, and we don't want to force a situation where one has to win out over the other. We want to find the means of enabling that data to circulate among them. And that's obviously technology that doesn't currently exist within Ohana, but our sense is that it's actually technology that's been built in other sectors for other problems, and it's just a matter of figuring out how to make it work in the right sequence here. And this specification that we now have was like the first necessary step on what will be a longer journey in that direction. So I want to spend some time to actually talk about like how we make decisions moving forward, like a little reflecting on the process a little bit. But does anybody else have questions, thoughts, things that you want to make sure we address while we're face to face? Okay. So when we originally started this about a year ago, I drafted, and I can actually share this here. I drafted like a memo of like, okay, based on my research of precedents for standards development and these kinds of projects, here are the moving pieces, the different parameters that we have to consider. And I proposed that there would be a work group of people with experience either in this field or in standards that would sort of review the development of the specification, the needs of our different users, advise us on both developing a viable format and also developing a governance process. I would say we were partly successful in that regard. The work group was pretty active on the technical level. We got great feedback from Neil at iCarol. Haley Pate was super involved. We had other people who weren't on the work group who got more and more involved over time. And I think that the spec really does, we're getting feedback, at least at a technical level, that this is looking good. The work group, and this is largely my, my inexperience with this, and also the challenges of like figuring this out as we go. We didn't do as much on the governance level. or really anything at all, frankly. We had people in the group who were technical people who wanted to talk about technical issues, and there was less interest in talking about the governance issue. And rather than push it, I just went with what was working personally. So this is a little bit of post-op in saying we sort of went halfway through the original proposed cycle, which was develop our conceptual universe, translate it into technical specifications, then advise on how it's going to be implemented and tested, and then advise on how it should be governed in the future. We only got halfway through that, and that's okay. We were really aiming for a minimally viable governance process, quote unquote, and I think we got there. And now I think it is more important, now that we have a spec, it's going to be used to recreate that process with ear towards governance. Towards having people think, so it's not just about me and whoever happens to show up on the call reporting back over email, that we actually have a known procedure without getting too bureaucratic for who decides, and more importantly, who decides who decides. And I'm not jumping from no governance process to fully formed elaborate rules and procedures. I still do want to approach this iteratively, and so I'm opening this question right now of, what would a successful work group look like? Because to be frank, this is a real challenge. The people we want, I think the people that we want participating in that conversation have limited time and resources already, and we're already asking many of them to go above and beyond on like the development of technology and the, advising on the specification and so on. To then have conversations about governance and process in many cases is really a tough ask. And so I'm being open with not entirely knowing how to address that. I think there are various options. I'm researching them and I'm looking for ideas. But I think, I see a few different options for how to move forward. We could say, A, once more with feeling, like we just create another a new work group, and we rededicate our intention to saying this work group has both these technical objectives and also these process objectives of thinking about how these decisions are being made. And I pledge to do a stronger job of getting people in the room with experience and interest in thinking about governance, even if they're forming their own sort of sub work group, and it's not everybody working on everything at the same time. Another possible path is to actually sort of rededicate our thinking about a work group for the initiative in the context of our pilot projects, which is to say recruiting and promoting leadership specifically from the people on the ground who are implementing these things and then have a direct perspective on the implications of various decisions and really should be the ones of making those decisions. The challenge with that is that the people in our pilot projects are already going above and beyond their existing roles and responsibilities in many cases, and so that's just to ask another layer of responsibility on top of it is a real challenge, and it may require fundraising, frankly, in order to support people in taking another hour or two a week or a month in order to participate in these conversations. I think there was a third option, but it's pretty fuzzy. I mean, I'm sifting through this, and if anybody is interested in thinking about it specifically with me, I would love to have a little buddy or even a small group that we can go through and coming into future calls, come out with at least a set of options that we then want to organize people around exploring, because I think the blank slate can be really intimidating. It certainly is to me. So that's my little spiel. Your thoughts on it? I'd like to, maybe we can just go around and get a sense of people one by one.
I really think the fundraising is the biggest issue, the biggest obstacle, because it really kind of gives people a sense that this is a project that can last the time it needs to complete, and hopefully in our kind of community building phase right now, getting more and more stakeholders involved, governments. I hope that this could be influential to any particular foundation that or group that could fund this kind of a worthy project.
Declan, what are your thoughts?
What are my thoughts? Sorry for not jumping in there. It's
that's all right.
It's a complicated question.
Yeah. And it's all right. It's all right to pass, of course. Like this is, we're just feeling this out right now. Yeah.
Well, I mean, certainly something that I'd be happy to follow up with you and anyone else who's interested afterwards. I guess my initial thought is just that it sometimes wasn't clear to me over the last 6 months how decisions were being made, and so just to be a little bit more public about that would certainly have helped me. I'm not too particular about, just would have liked to know more what it was.
Devin, any thoughts? I know that you've had experience with open source development elsewhere. All right. Saskia, having gotten a look at the pilot on the ground, do you have thoughts on this big picture governance question?
We need at least one person who's working on the ground on this governance piece. I'm new to the project, but some of the things I've learned already is that when these things were planned or decisions were made in a bubble without consulting social service providers, there were some things that don't quite work that could have been flagged earlier. So I don't think you need a team of entirely people involved in pilots, but it would be good to have at least one person.
Okay. So I can address Declan's point to at least on one tactical level before we then sort of have final thoughts. I'm going to chat in. This was a document that we did sort of use internally, and it was mostly for the purpose of developing Ohana, or at least getting a sense of like what kind of feedback we were getting on Ohana and how we were prioritizing it. So this is, I think, this may or may not be the same format that we would want for the development of the specification itself, but you can see how this format is, as a type of user, I want to do a thing, take an action, so that I meet some sort of benefit, the goal of that action. And we've been tracking, like, where is the source of this coming from? What does this user view themselves as, since we were assigning them labels? What type of user story is this, and what's the status? Now, I think something like this is what we are going to be developing moving forward. And I mentioned earlier that we're going to be bringing on a data analyst in some capacity to be able to lead this in partnership with the projects. And so without specifying to that person how they're going to be doing their work, the idea is that we're going to be documenting the experiences of the pilots, aggregating potentially actionable issues from that, and in a way that's more deliberately public, having conversations about them, probably in conversations like these. The cadence of the thing is I think, a really big question. How often are we going to be meeting to have these conversations? How often do we want to be taking new actions to make new things possible? That's a real open question. But the idea is that we're going to have a clearly aggregated universe of situations and possible actions, and we'll have a process of prioritizing those, giving deference to the people who are as close to the ground as possible, right? And as active in actual implementation as possible. And so if we get a suggestion of a thing from a place that's just tinkering with Ohana and they really want a thing, we'll add it to the list. But it's really going to be the people, the stakeholders on the ground in our pilots, who are saying these are the most important 3 things that we need to address in the next cycle, or whatever it may be. but again, I think the question of who are the specific set of people who are taking the responsibility and the privilege of gathering to actually make decisions when decisions need to be made, that's still an open question to my mind. And so I'm sort of defaulting somewhere in between these two options of trying once more again with feeling to form a work group, essentially according to the original vision, and at the same time leaning more on our pilots, pushing more to identify people who have this head for not just like the actual face-to-face interaction, but how that ripples up through the products and even into the specification itself and the implications of those decisions, finding people and figuring out what it's going to take to promote their capacity to actually participate in these high-level conversations, so that they can at least be participating alongside quote-unquote experts and people who are actually developing these enterprise-level systems, which was very much like the most active voices in the room this time around. So anyways, I'm thinking about that. I'm going to be sort of developing as we have 1.0 like officially come out, and I'm going to be sharing some of these reflections. And if you're interested in talking with me about that, helping craft agenda for future conversations, I would really welcome that engagement. For now, though, we are at 1 o'clock. I'm happy to keep talking a little bit if there's other things people want to chat about, but at this point, we're pretty much at time. So any final thoughts, go ahead and share. But otherwise, we'll hop off unless you want to stay on.
So is there going to be a kind of like a final document produced for this?
Yeah, I was expecting that to come out this week. My apologies. I think Sophia was just waiting to see us, see that we all got on a call and nobody had any final issues that they were going to be yelling about. But basically the version 0.9 had this one ongoing issue, and it's been resolved in the direction of the community's pretty much broad consensus. And the other issues seem to be pretty minor. And I also proposed pretty much at the last minute a change in license, and that's actually in the document and in GitHub. And after talking about it with CFA, since we were pretty much at the end of that cycle, we're going to make that an agenda item for review moving forward. I'm proposing a change in the license from Creative Commons 0, which is essentially public domain with no restrictions whatsoever on use, to Creative Commons 4.0 share alike, which essentially says you can use this, you can adapt it, that's all free, but if you want to change it and promote this changed version, you have to do so under an open source license just like this one. And I think that's an important starting point for us moving forward, although we are going to be taking that up as like one of the first orders of business of this next cycle.
Cool. So when can we expect the dot?
I expect it on Monday.
Great.
And we can sort of send a note to Sophia to make sure that if it's not going to be on Monday, we know when it will be. And final thoughts on these conversations. For a while I was having them every other week. Then I got the sense that people had their heads down, they were working on things, and it's been now a couple months. I could go back to an every other week status. I think I'm going to be more diligent about bringing newbies on into an orientation. But if you have thoughts about like how often you'd want to have these conversations moving forward into these next cycles, please do share. We're not trying to do this in a super formal way. It's not like we need everybody to participate in every one. I think it's useful to be able to get face-to-face and actually talk through things every once in a while, even if it's not like a formal process. But we'll welcome your thoughts on the cadence of that. All right. So yeah, if you want to jump off, go ahead. And if you want to stay on and talk with me about this boring process stuff, I'm happy to talk about it.
Thanks, Greg.
All right, y'all.
Yeah. Thank you, Greg. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
I'm willing to talk about boring process stuff.
Yeah.
But if I'm the only one, I could come do this in person. Too.
Yeah, you can come over here to the hub if you want. I have time.
I just, as long as I'm still on the call,
Yeah.
can I just expand a little bit on what I was saying there?
Yeah, please. By all means.
Yeah. So I mean, as I'm sure you guessed, it's about the one-to-n, n-to-m debate, right? And so specifically, what I found surprising about that was that in version 0.4 of the spec, it was in the format that we've in the end decided on using, right? And so at some point it changed, and I'm not sure where. And before I brought that up in the Google Doc, I went through all the public documentation that I could find. I went through the GitHub repos. I went through the mailing list archives, and I couldn't find a discussion around why it had changed. And I still don't know why it changed or when or who decided to. So that's what I'm referring to.
So yeah, I had to do some digging myself, and I'm not gonna. I will not defend the process here, other than the fact that once I saw that something had happened, I was like, actually, we got to address this.
Thank you for doing that in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think it actually might have been an honest mistake in that I think the result of a conversation that Sophia might have made a fix based on that conversation about sites and services that wasn't actually quite correct, and then Monsef pointed out that it wasn't correct and was like, "Oh, Ohana's like this. Let's just do it like this." And Sophia was like, and I weighed in on that thread, being like, that's not really how we should make these decisions based on design considerations that were made back when Ohana was first being built. I don't think I at the time connected the dots to understand that actually there had been a decision made, and then this is talking about actually changing the decision. It was in the context of there's a problem here, let's fix it in this direction, and I didn't quite understand that. So, and that did come up when I was talking with Monsef, and just ultimately that was why, to my perspective, this was just ultimately something that had to be dealt with on the Ohana side and not really in the spec itself. And I do apologize for essentially having that conversation multiple times. To an extent, that's probably going to happen in projects like these inevitably, and we do want to be more careful about consolidating those discussions. And ultimately, I think the answer is probably like, if this had really been documented in GitHub, which Sophia wanted, that's an example of the kind of thing that would have been easier to be like, oh, we had this here. And it was very much like I was pressing for us to develop this in a medium that was more accessible than GitHub. I think there may be a case to be made that we should simply figure out means of accessing GitHub that are accessible. Rather than splitting this between Google Docs and GitHub, because I do think problems like that are going to come up.
But just to be clear, I mean, this wasn't in any of those places.
There was. I have had trouble finding the comments in Google Docs. There was a thread in Google Docs where Sophia and Monsef were talking about this. It was like 0.4, 0.7, and I chimed in, but then the thread just got closed and the decision was made.
I see. It was a comment thread in one of the earlier versions.
That's
of the
right.
spec. Okay, got it.
And so yeah, I definitely did see that thread happening. I chimed in, but I wasn't carefully on the lookout for it in the next one. I also don't think that Sophia was keeping a strong changelog, which we were at first, but Google Docs doesn't really make it easy. And so I'm sympathetic to her because she was dealing with a situation that we really pushed for, and it wasn't a good one. And I don't think that we then coped with the challenges of that situation all that effectively. And I just had to be careful about going through the manual way and calling people up one-on-one and sifting through it as best as I could. But I have seen some things coming out of Ben Balter's blog where he's sharing some scripts that would make it easier for you to show a GitHub issues page without having all this stuff that still even confuses me around it. That may be an important priority for us, is to be able to use GitHub in a way that doesn't scare away people who don't know what GitHub is.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, cool. Well, thanks. I just wanted to
totally
make you aware of that.
I appreciate that, and I think it's a great example of, like, I mean, we got through it, I think, pretty well. I think the conversations, it took more time than I think I would have wanted us to take, but the conversations were really rich and respectful, and I think gave us a really nuanced understanding of the challenges, and so I appreciate that. So.
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna leave you guys.
Yeah. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. Saskia, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Take care, guys.
All right. Saskia, you want to come over here? I have a call at 4 p.m.
Okay.
And then I'm talking with the library person at 5. But if you want to come over, I'm about to go get lunch. Yeah.
I should change post yoga anyway. So.
Okay. All right.
You're probably around too.
All right. I'll see you shortly.